Hello, my name is Colin Edwards and I'm a postdoc in Elizabeth Krohn's lab at Tufts University. Today I want to talk to you about some work I've been doing on monarch butterflies. I know I'm a disembodied voice right now, but in person I look like this, and on social media I look like this. If you see me, say hi. In recent years, there's been a huge interest in the loss of formerly widespread species, especially insects. Understanding the patterns of these losses can help us to understand both their causes and their consequences. Today, I'm going to talk to you about the western monarch butterfly, which has experienced a severe population decline. Now, you probably have heard of the eastern monarch butterfly, which overwinters in Mexico and across successive generations spreads throughout the eastern United States and Canada each summer, and then the final generation flies back down to Mexico to overwinter again. The western monarch butterfly does a similar thing. Individuals overwinter on the coast of California, here shaded in blue on the map, and then across 3 to 5 generations they spread throughout the western United States, basically until they hit the Rocky Mountains. In the fall, the last generation, which are probably about the great-grandchildren of the original individuals, they fly back to the overwintering sites along the coast. This yearly expansion is really cool. It's aesthetically pleasing, it's one of the most well-known migrations in North America, and it's something that connects with just about everyone I talk to, scientists and non-scientists alike. Now, when we look at that yearly range expansion, it's really the product of two mechanisms. Adult monarch butterflies fly, often quite far, to find milkweed plants and to lay their eggs. Those eggs then hatch into caterpillars, and the original adults die. But those caterpillars feed, pupate, and become adults themselves, and they are able to repeat that process. So when we look at this map of their yearly range expansion, what we're really looking at is both the movement of individuals and that overall population growth. Now, the western monarch butterfly has declined severely in the last few decades. Note that this figure is on a log scale. In the 1900s, we estimated between 3 and 10 million butterflies on the West Coast. In the 2000s, this had dropped to 200 to 300,000 individuals. And in early 2018, we had about an 85% decline, so that for the last 2 years, we've had about 30,000 individuals. Just 30,000. That decline in early 2018 is not really the focus of this talk, but I want to point out that the percent decline, that 85% decline, that's not actually that unusual when compared to other declines in the last few decades. It's really just notable because it has led to the lowest population abundance to date. Now, having 30,000 individuals is particularly concerning because this is when experts predicted that we might expect to see Lee effects. That is, reduced population growth rates due to small population sizes. For monarch butterflies, we might imagine that they could have trouble finding mates. After all, today we have about 1% of the numbers that we had 30 years ago. This is not good, and it actually relates to the population range expansion that I talked about earlier. There are a couple of reasons why we might expect that the population declines of monarch butterflies have interfered with that yearly population range expansion. First, if we are seeing Lee effects, that means that we're seeing reduced population growth rates. And there is a lot of ecological theory demonstrating that when a population's growth rate is reduced, its rate of spatial expansion should also be reduced. Additionally, there are many species with density-dependent movement behavior, such that they move more slowly and travel shorter distances when there are fewer individuals around. Either of these mechanisms could decrease the yearly population range expansion, which has both biological implications and also social ones. That range expansion allows monarch butterflies to increase in density throughout the western United States, and that population growth in the summer helps to compensate from low survival every winter. At the same time, the monarch butterfly has captured the interest and imagination of the public, and a lot of that is because of this iconic yearly range expansion. In collaboration with Elizabeth Krohn, Cheryl Schultz, and Emma Pelton, I have worked to determine how monarch movement has changed as their population declined. One of the cool things about working with monarch butterflies is that because so many people are excited about them, we have substantial community science data. For example, many people use the smartphone app iNaturalist to report sightings of interesting plants and animals, including monarch butterflies. I've combined data on monarch butterflies from museum specimens and from those community scientist reportings. Mostly the database is collected and curated by the Xerxes Society in their Western Monarch Milkweed Mapper, and by iNaturalist. Today I'm going to focus on observations in the 5 most western states and in British Columbia. After removing some outliers and small non-migratory populations, we have more than 6,000 observations from the late 1800s to last year. To look at how population size has impacted the range expansion of these butterflies, I'm going to focus on breaking the data into 3 time periods, which correspond to the 3 different orders of magnitude of population sizes. So all of our data before 2000 will be lumped together. That's when we had millions of butterflies. And then all of our data from 2000 to 2017 will also be lumped together. That's when we had hundreds of thousands of butterflies. And finally, we'll lump together all of the data from the last 2 years, when we had roughly 30,000 individuals. When we map our data based on these categories, we see patterns suggesting that the population expansion has been slower since 2017. So here, each point represents an observation of a monarch butterfly at that location before June 1st in any of the years in that category. And we can see that the red points, which represent the last 2 years, are much more clustered around the California overwintering sites than the points from the earlier 2000s or from the 1900s. That pattern is even more obvious when we look at points up through July 1st. Now, if you look at this map, you'll probably notice that there is another difference. Not only are the points in 2018 and 2019 much closer to the coast and they aren't really going up into Washington, but there are also just a lot fewer of them. And so rather than just eyeballing this, we really need a quantifiable metric, something that is robust to differences in sample size. We start by finding the distance from each observation to the nearest overwintering site, which I've plotted here in pink. With that, we can plot our data with day of year on the x-axis and distance from overwintering sites on the y-axis. We can now easily see that the range expansion starts in the late spring, and it certainly doesn't look like it's gone as far in the last few years, those big red dots, than in the past years. However, this is really just another way of plotting the same raw data that we saw on those maps, and it has the same problem that there are different sample sizes between our different categories. And so to really dig into this, we combined 2 statistical tools. The first is Quantile Regression, which is very useful in ecology. It's robust to outliers and to messy data, it's robust to changes in sample size, and it can characterize different parts of a distribution. So we want to characterize the outer edge of the monarch movement. Additionally, it's very easy to use in the programming language R. So what really is a quantile? The idea of a quantile is that it separates a fraction of a distribution or a data set. If this were the distribution of our data for a slice in time, the 0.9 quantile would separate the 10% of the values that are the most extreme from the 90% that are less extreme. The basic idea with quantile regression is that we might expect that that distribution would be changing based on some other factor. For us, we might expect that it would change as the day of the year changes. So we might expect to see something kind of like this. Quantile regression draws the line that puts the desired fraction of data points beneath it while minimizing the distance to all data points. For you stats nerds, it minimizes the L1 norm. So this is fantastic if we want to fit a linear model, that is, a straight line through our data. But you probably notice that we don't really have a linear pattern here. Instead, we have something hump-shaped that looks kind of like a normal distribution, or a bell curve. And that brings me to the second tool that we used, which is a system for fitting Gaussian curves with linear models. This is a Gaussian curve. You might be familiar with the normal distribution, which is a special case of the Gaussian curve, defined by this intimidating-looking equation. The general equation for a Gaussian curve is much simpler, but it's still not a linear model, so we can't easily fit it with quantile regression. However, if we take that equation for the general Gaussian curve and we take the log of both sides, we end up with this, which is a quadratic function. And this this is a linear model. I don't have time to get into the math, but we actually have a manuscript in the works on how to use this technique to fit data and how to interpret the results. So by log transforming our data, and then by fitting it with a quantile regression, we're able to characterize the yearly population expansion. Here we're going to be looking at the 0.9 quantile, which is the distance that separates the furthest 10% of the butterflies from the rest. This is a measure of population range expansion that's not sensitive to extreme outliers, but you should know that we find very similar patterns if we use other values for the quantile, like 0.8 or 0.7. Here, we're going to be looking at maps of the raw data up top, and then down below, we're going to show the fitted curve. We can see in the early spring the start of the range expansion, right about now. And now in May, we can start to see that the curves are really diverging, with the more recent years going less far. And now we are seeing the monarch butterflies heading back to the overwintering grounds. Okay, so now we have these fitted curves, and I don't really have time to show you, but we've done a lot of simulations to show that they are not sensitive to sample size, so these are very real. And if we look at them, we can see that something huge happened in 2018 and 2019. That curve is a lot lower. I don't really have time to get into the math, but we've worked out how to characterize different aspects of these fitted curves. And today I'm going to be focusing on the maximum distance, and I'll also touch on the day of the maximum distance, which is essentially representing when the butterflies stop expanding outwards and start heading back to the overwintering sites. So, with all of that work, all of that methods development stuff, is the monarch population range expansion declining? When we look at these curves, it looks like there isn't much difference between the 1900s and the early 2000s, even though we went from millions of butterflies to hundreds of thousands. But there is a pretty dramatic difference starting in 2018. If we go through the math that I was talking about on that last slide, with our bootstrap confidence intervals, we can see that the difference is very significant. This looks pretty bad. It looks like they're traveling almost half the distance that they were before. But let's put this into context on an actual map. If we look at the western United States, we might think about the overwintering site at Bodega Bay. This is one of the northernmost overwintering sites. In the 1900s and the early 2000s, that 0.9 quantile reaches all the way up to Spokane, Washington, so that at their furthest, 10% of the monarch butterflies were at least that far away from the overwintering grounds. However, in the last few years, that 0.9 quantile only just barely reaches to Bend, Oregon. With our fitted curves, we can also ask other questions. One that fascinates me is, when is the range expansion stopping and the monarch butterflies start returning to the overwintering sites? That is, what is the day of that peak distance? It's a little hard to see on these curves, but it looks like they might be shifting so that the peaks are a little bit earlier in the year in the later curves. And when we calculate the actual values using the methods in our preprint, you can see that, in the last couple of years, the population range expansion has stopped almost a week earlier than it did in the 1900s. To briefly summarize the results, we can see that we have this hugely reduced population range expansion, and we also see that the range expansion is stopping a bit sooner. I want to focus on that first part because I think it's the most important thing here. So we see this dramatic change. Is this change good or bad? Well, the answer from a human perspective is pretty clear. It's really bad. If you are in Washington State, you are now unlikely to see monarch butterflies, even though 3 years ago you probably saw some. From a population persistence standpoint, though, the answer is a lot more complicated. So we saw that something big happened following the crash in early 2018. Let's return for a second to those two processes that we think might impact yearly monarch range expansion. The first is the demographic Lee effect, where we might expect to see reduced population growth rate because of small numbers. If this was the underlying cause of the changes we saw, this would be really bad. The population was already declining, and if we reduce their growth rate even further, they will likely spiral towards extinction. On the other hand, the reduced expansion might be due to changes in monarch movement behavior, and that could indirectly actually be good. So if we think about the Ali effect for monarchs, we're thinking about density-dependent processes like finding a mate. And remember that today we have about 1% of the monarch butterflies we did before. So where there used to be 200 individuals, we would now have only 2. And it's very easy to imagine that an adult monarch butterfly might have trouble finding a mate. However, if the monarchs aren't traveling as far, then we have fewer butterflies, but they're packed in a smaller space, and it's possible that this could mitigate potential Ali effects. I'm really hopeful that that is what's going on, and I think there's some evidence for it. If we look at this plot of monarch abundance through time, right now we're seeing up through 2018. If an Ali effect was driving the changes in movement that we observed, we would expect 2019's butterfly counts to be even lower than 2018's. But they're not. We have roughly the same number. Now, we're still waiting to find out what the numbers are in 2020. A bunch of volunteers do a big count at the overwintering sites at Thanksgiving, and then they do another one on New Year's Day. We will see what is happening, but I am very, very hopeful that maybe their population isn't rapidly going extinct. To conclude, it looks like we are losing this migratory phenomenon that has captured so much public interest and imagination, and we need to think about how much we want to protect it. In this talk, and the related study, we've established a pattern, but we don't know the underlying mechanism, and I hope that I've demonstrated that the mechanism itself really matters. The last point that I'd like to make is that I think this is a really nice example of how valuable community science can be when partnered with proper tools. None of this study would have been possible without the thousands of reportings through iNaturalist by everyday people. And with that, I would like to thank our funding sources, NSF and the Department of Defense Legacy Program, and also the Krohn, Oriens, and Schultz Lab, who have all given fantastic feedback on this project. As I said before, the data itself mostly comes from iNaturalist and the Xerxes Society, which have been extremely helpful. And with that, thank you for listening. If this were a talk in person, I would say ask me any questions. And you know what? That still holds. Feel free to tweet at me or to email me. Thanks.